Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of All Things Policy. I am Mariam Azeemuddin, working as Assistant Program Manager at Takshashila. Today, we're tackling a hot topic: industrial subsidy wars. What are they? Why should we care? And how does it impact global trade? I'm quite curious to know myself. So let's get our geoeconomics researcher Anisree Suresh to shed some light on this complex issue.
Thank you, Mariam, for having me. Let's dive into this interesting topic of industrial subsidy wars. So basically, industrial subsidy wars have
Yes.
become increasingly relevant in recent years due to their profound impact on international trade. So subsidies, as many of you know, are financial aids provided by governments to domestic industries without equivalent exchange, often to bolster competitiveness or achieve strategic objectives.
Anishree, why are these subsidy wars such a big deal now? I mean, I'm seriously wondering.
Yes. So countries use subsidies to support industries crucial to their economic and strategic interest. So, for instance, if you look at the aerospace sector or the clean energy sectors, they often receive a lot of substantial government support so that they can ensure supply chain security or advanced technological capabilities. However, when one country heavily subsidizes its industries, others feel very much compelled to do the same to stay competitive. So, leading to what we call the current subsidy race or war. So, government subsidies have emerged as a critical tool in the global economic landscape in the recent years. Especially, we have a lot of geopolitical tensions and economic uncertainties, and that's also exacerbated by events like the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have war in Ukraine. All these conflicts are further exacerbating the existing geopolitical tensions. So these subsidies are increasingly used by all these major economies like the United States, China, and the European
All right.
Union to bolster domestic industries, particularly in strategic sectors such as green technologies and advanced manufacturing.
Wait a minute. Can you give us an example of how these subsidy wars play out in real life?
Certainly. So subsidies are the transfer of resources from a government to a domestic entity without an equivalent contribution in return. So they can take many forms, including the direct grants to domestic companies, incentives, or favorable terms of financing. And governments might want to achieve a national strategic objective or to gain a competitive edge in international markets. So think of production subsidies in high tech industries, for example, such as aerospace and telecommunication, which can be used to ensure predictable or guaranteed supply chains or to protect other national security interests. So, for example, U.S. Inflation Reduction Act or the European Union's Green
Right.
Deal Industrial Plan and the Made in China
Correct.
2025 strategy, these all kind of these policies raised concerns about the potential for subsidy wars because it leads to subsidy competition that leads to a race to the bottom. So taking deeper dive into these examples of US Inflation Reduction Act and all these policies, and also China's Made in China 2025 strategy, they involve massive subsidies to boost domestic industries like semiconductor manufacturing or clean
Hmm.
energy technologies.
Yeah.
And these subsidies encourage domestic production and trigger responses from other countries, which lead to a cycle of escalating subsidies and potential trade tensions. So, President Biden's IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act
Yeah.
amplified and implemented subsidies in response to China's subsidies. So, under the guise of investment to fight climate change or a lower healthcare cost and collect higher tax revenue, this Inflation Reduction Act of USA includes kind of enormous subsidies in the forms of tax incentives, grants, and the loan guarantees to bolster the manufacturing sector in the United States. But some of these subsidies, notably around the EV batteries, are available to investments in countries with which US has a free trade agreement. So try to also support the allied countries of the US as well.
Of
So,
course.
however,
Yeah.
if you look at it, like China also has a lot of like subsidies given to their EV sector and also. So it's like a counter and acts and counteracts related to subsidies.
Right. But conversely, do you think subsidies help the economies incentivize production in the strategic sectors? I mean, for
Mm-hmm.
example, the majestic pull of the Inflation Reduction Act's incentives to the US have been immense. If you
Yeah.
take a look, tax credits for up to, $7,500 per vehicle have created a surge of inbound investment in the US manufacturing of EVs and their batteries. And in the first 12 months since the Inflation Reduction Act was implemented in the US, the private sector has announced more than, I guess, what is it, $110 billion in the
Yes,
new clean energy
$100 billion. Yes.
manufacturing investments, and including more than 70 billion US dollars, I guess, in the EV supply chain.
Yes.
With a trade credit that could shave the cost of battery production by between, I think, 35 to 42%, I guess. The economics of battery and EV manufacturing have been appended to such an extent that, traditional car manufacturing nations have been forced to respond with their own subsidy programs. What do you think about it? And similarly, also, I was just wondering, the incentives available under the CHIPS Act have pulled advanced semiconductor manufacturers back to the US or encouraged them to enter for, the first time. Intel, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, and Samsung are all in the line to receive billions of dollars in funding under CHIPS to establish advanced semiconductor fabs in the US.
Indeed, Mariam, it actually does. So that's why industrial subsidies have been used extensively over by these countries as a geoeconomic tool. However, one another aspect that we have to look into here is like using subsidies causes a misalignment between prices and production cost. So in doing so, they kind of distort the market by preventing efficient outcomes and divert resources to less productive ones. So if subsidies benefit some firms over others, they can snuff out innovation and force efficient firms to contract out work or exit the market altogether, which leads to kind of an activity called rent seeking behavior, where certain activities that manipulate the distribution of economic resources to bring positive returns to individual but not the society, and that way they harm the smaller economies that cannot afford to subsidize. So this subsidize may lead
Hmm.
trading partners to believe that a government is promoting unfair competition, and that could kind of compel them to react in kind.
So, quite interesting, but in what kind of situations justify the use of subsidies? I'm curious to know that.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. And economic theory kind of recognizes that the subsidies, they kind of damage welfare unless they are granted to correct for an externality or a market failure. So, like states often
Hmm.
justify the
Right.
subsidies they grant to attract investments based on
Okay.
expected net increases in tax revenues. So, in other words, certain attracted investment lead to greater social benefits than the market accounts for. Then this externality must be corrected by granting a subsidy. Okay. But there are like different versions of it where state subsidize actually
Yeah.
kind of influence the business actions and in a way that attracts the incentive package that causes the business to invest in a state in which otherwise it would have not chosen
Right.
to its investment. Okay. So here
You're
the
right.
efficient
Hmm.
allocation of resources is being distorted, leading to inefficiencies within the national economy unless the subsidy corrects for an externality. However, if states are unlikely to measure externalities properly, then welfare will still be reduced or at least not enhanced in the situation. Then, if you look at the another scenario in which the state subsidies have no effect on the business investment decisions, in the another scenario is where they either because differences in the competing subsidy offers are not significant enough to overcome other factors that businesses like to consider.
Right.
So because in a way that the subsidies does not
Hmm.
have an impact on the business investment. So
Yeah.
here they would look into
Sure.
other factors that influence the business to come into do business in that particular locality. So they look into other factors, and here subsidies are not necessarily an influencing factor for these businesses. So under either of these situations, subsidy was transfer
Mhm.
much or even all of the net social benefits to the attracted enterprises.
That sounds intense, huh? But how do these subsidy wars affect global trade? Like, I'm just wondering,
Yeah,
how would it be
yes, it actually
affecting global trade in
significantly
the US?
distort market
Does it
dynamics.
distort market dynamics? Or, yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yes. So it actually does. It significantly distorts the market dynamics. So one is by artificially lowering production costs or supporting exports, subsidies can create unfair advantages and disadvantaging unsubsidized competitors and distorting trade flows. So developing countries in particular may struggle to compete against heavily subsidized goods from more affluent Western countries. So, whether driven by economic motives such as industrial development, supply chain resilience, and technology adoption, or non economic concerns such as the national security, health, and the environment, these interventions are anticipated to have discernible impacts on economic outcomes. So, directing resources
Hmm.
towards certain sectors, firms, and activities, as well as industrial policies and subsidies, they kind of alter the relative efficiency and affect international trade flows. So, when directed towards import competing industries, subsidies are expected to expand domestic production and curtail imports, aligning with import substitution strategies.
So, any economic evaluation of these subsidy programs must grapple with their dual nature, isn't it? While intended to foster economic growth and innovation domestically, they often distort international trade dynamics, I feel.
Yes, exactly.
Provided the subsidies provided under the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, totaling, I guess, $370 billion for the companies adopting green, technologies, illustrate this trend. And in response, under President Ursula von der Leyen, the European Union has relaxed its state aid rules to support its own green industries, highlighting a tit for tat escalation. So, can you tell me more about how the economic risk subsidies pose here?
Yeah, very, very interesting question, Mariam. So, there are actually a few challenges and risks associated with the subsidy wars. So, one is mainly retaliation and escalation, where subsidies intend to
Yeah,
attract investment can quickly escalate into retaliatory measures, as seen between the US and China and the EU. So, this escalation
clearly
kind of
seeing that, I guess, huh?
yes. So this escalation undermines the efficiency gains from trade and could lead to net loss in global welfare if subsidies exceeds the benefits they generate. So second impact is the global impact. While the subsidies may boost domestic
Very
industries,
important one too.
yeah. So here, what is the impact of it as like because these subsidies boost domestic industries, they kind of distort the global markets. For instance, subsidies directed towards green technologies might not be the most cost-effective means of reducing global greenhouse gases emissions if cheaper alternatives exist elsewhere. And the third one is the fiscal concerns. Here, the fiscal burden of subsidies, particularly if interest rates rise, could
Right.
strain national budgets and limit
Hmm.
future policy flexibility. So, this concern is heightened for countries without significant fiscal space to compete on the same scale.
Yeah. Also, I was just, if you look at the geopolitical implications, there are a few challenges subsidies would pose. I mean, the first one being the multilateral strain. Okay. And, the World Trade Organization's rules on subsidies are ill equipped to handle the complexities of modern subsidy practices, which clearly is leading to, unilateral actions and, they would rather than coordinating multilateral solutions. The
Yeah.
second one would be diplomatic tensions, which is subsidy wars strain diplomatic relations, which is, I think, a very important, aspect to look at, especially among allies like the US and EU, European Union. And at a time when global cooperation is critical in addressing broader challenges such as climate change and geopolitical instability.
Yeah, so that's why like it's very important to address the subsidy wars, and in a multilateral level, I guess. Yes, indeed.
Of course, this is the main part where I would like to know what's the role of the World Trade Organization and what role are they playing in all of this?
Yeah, so the WTO's agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures kind of the sets the rules to prevent subsidies from harming fair trade practices. So the WTO categorizes subsidies into three types, that is prohibited, actionable, and
Right.
non-actionable types. So this categorization basically is trying to aim to ensure that subsidies don't undermine the benefits of negotiated trade agreements or provoke retaliatory measures among the member states. So while WTO members generally comply with these rules set by the WTO, some are alleged to have like reneged on their commitments, with most of the focus being on China. So the main concern against China is that the subsidies provided to the state-owned enterprises by the Chinese government. So the US and the other countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries had complained that China
Right.
enables these state-owned enterprises to gain unfair competitive advantages in the global market. So, for example, the US believes subsidies play
That
the yeah, so the US believes that the subsidies play a very leading role in generating overcapacity of Chinese steel producing state owned enterprises, thereby creating unfair competitive conditions for US workers and businesses by distorting the proper functioning of global steel markets. So, this concern, along with a range of
happens.
other US complaints related to China's economic policies, underpinned by escalating geopolitical rivalry, recently led to a rise of tit for tat tariff impositions on many Chinese and US export products worth hundreds of billions of dollars, threatening the functioning of world trade and the future of the World Trade Organization. So, also furthermore, countries like Japan, European Union, along with the US, collectively constituting the trilateral cooperation group, they are like advocating negotiations to reform the disciplines governing these industrial subsidies.
Actually, speaking on another thing that I want to know is, speaking for the minority, how do these wars impact smaller economies or less, industrialized nations?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. Actually, smaller economies who often lack the financial resources to match the subsidy levels of larger nations kind of gets
Right.
mostly affected by these kind of subsidy wars. So, since they lack the resources, it creates an imbalance that forces them to accept unfavorable trade terms, or they risk losing market share to subsidized competitors. So it undermines the principles of like fair competition and can deter foreign investments needed for the economic development. So developing countries are most vulnerable to the trade distorting effects of subsidies. And they rely on trade to drive economic growth, reduce poverty, diversify their economies, and respond to climate change. To attract investment, they need the certainty provided by a
Right.
credible and coherent system of global trade rules, and they also need to
Mhm.
be able to compete on fair terms, a capacity that trade distortive subsidies and protection policies will hurt. So basically, if you look at it, it's mainly two types how the developing countries are affected by these subsidy wars. One is mainly the trade distortion, where subsidies again distort the trade flows, disadvantaging the developing countries that rely on global markets for economic growth and development. And since they lack the fiscal resources or institutional capacity to respond effectively with their own subsidies or countermeasures. Second is the policy uncertainty that it creates. So, a fractured global trading system kind of undermines the certainty that developing countries need to attract investment and integrate it into the global value
Right.
chains. So, that again hinders their economic development goals.
Fascinating insights, Anishree. And but I have like one last question. And what's the path forward? Genuinely, how can we mitigate the negative effects of these subsidy wars? And do you think the reformed multilateral setup will actually be able to address these issues? Because they are issues and somebody needs to address them. What do you think about it?
So, to better address these challenges posed by the modern industrial subsidies, there are we need a combination of transparency, international cooperation, and possibly reforming existing WTO rules. And encouraging dialogue and setting clear guidelines on acceptable subsidy practices can also help foster a more balanced and sustainable global trade environment. So basically, what we can do is to mitigate these risks and foster more stable global economic environment. One is again enhance the multilateral cooperation. So multilateral efforts are urgently needed to reform subsidy rules under the WTO, then address the gaps in coverage and enhance transparency and compliance within the WTO
Yeah.
ecosystem. Second is economic diplomacy. So rather than engaging in subsidy wars, major economies should prioritize
Right.
diplomatic solutions and cooperative frameworks that promote fair competition and global economic stability.
How far do you think all of this will work?
Yeah, so in the sense, this trade war is going to be the phenomena of the future. It's gonna stay, but by enhancing a multilateral cooperation and economic diplomacy, and also building data and transparency through improved data collection and transparency on subsidy practices, kind of you'll be able to bring a lot of changes in the multilateral system. So again, I have to re-emphasize the point that while the government subsidies definitely
Mhm.
play a crucial role in achieving the economic and environmental objectives, certain times what happens is their misuse or overuse lead to unintended consequences. So addressing these kind of challenges requires concerted effort to strengthen global governance frameworks and promote sustainable economic practices that benefit all nations, especially the developing countries. So again, what the main issue is not whether government should subsidize environmentally friendly industries or not. So it's widely acknowledged that
Yeah.
because of these kind of subsidies, certain kind of social returns is happening, on social returns on the green
Right.
investment that exceed the return that accrue to private firms. Governments must provide certain kind of investment incentives to these kind of underinvested areas. But here the issue is
Mhm.
whether government should offer those incentives only to domestic companies. Okay. So coming
Yeah.
back to your earlier
Yes.
point on the multilateral arena and what how the
Yes.
WTO can address the issue of subsidies. So they can take many forms and serve various objectives. So it may not be easy to identify which kind of subsidies need to be addressed. So some of the subsidies are
Mhm.
grants or in-kind contributions or tax or tariff incentives, preferential financing, all those kind of things. So how they take place depend in part on country specific fiscal or administrative capacities. So it's therefore important to establish definitions or categories for various types of subsidies for the purposes of identification, monitoring, impact evaluation, and negotiation.
Mhm. So you're saying there is a hope out there.
Definitely. So, we need to, since the geo-economic situation is getting more fragmented and there's a lot of tensions in the geopolitical scenario, we need to have a
Yeah.
very strengthened rule-based multilateral system to look into various challenges that the current economic era is posing.
You're right. All right, Anisree. Then thank you for your expertise on this complex issue, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Join us next time as we continue exploring the ever evolving landscape of international trade. Until then, stay informed and stay curious. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.